Hi, everybody. I would like to welcome you on June 3rd, 2021, to the second season of the COVID Conversation Symposium brought to you by Ready for Black Lives. We are broadcasting from the Indigenous land, currently called Canada. And we are an organization here at Ready for Black Lives that is invested in informing people across these territories and the world about the threats and opportunities of artificial intelligence, technology to our health and our collective well-being. Now, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement, and then I will introduce our speakers that are going to be joining us today. And then we will go straight into the screening and panel discussion, and we hope that you will participate using the chat, and we will do our best to incorporate your questions. But before we begin and go any further, I want to make sure that we begin with our land acknowledgement. And so, we'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered today and by acknowledging the caretakers of this land. This land is the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the ancestral and traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Huron-Wendat nations. It is critical that we not only acknowledge Canada's settler and colonial history and present and our own positions on this land, but that we stop the wheels of ongoing colonization in their tracks, the gross disrespect for Indigenous lives, nations, and land. Contact your Premier, your Prime Minister, flood them with your concerns. Be more unrelenting than those governments and people that seek to extinguish Indigenous life. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to remind us about the death of Regis Korchinski-Paquette on May 27, 2020. A 29-year-old Indigenous Ukrainian Black Canadian woman who was alive when the police arrived in her home, were supposed to assist, but instead she fell to her death from a balcony and we are still waiting for justice, and without justice, there is no peace. I'd also like to take this opportunity to be in support and recognition of Joy Equan, a 37-year-old Indigenous woman who died on September 28, 2020, in the hospital where she should have received care but was left to die by clinicians in St. Charles, Quebec. That trial is ongoing, and our hearts go out to you. And to the 215 Indigenous children who were taken from their homes and taken to Canada's largest residential school, who never got to return, who were never returned to their parents. I wear orange today in solidarity and in recognition that there are so many more to be found and brought home and repatriated and treated respectfully. And our hearts go out to you. Without justice, there is no peace. And now I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our presenters or speakers with us today. And we will be speaking with Dr. Nehal El-Hadi. She is a writer, a researcher, and editor whose work explores the relationships between the body, the racialized body, the gendered body, place, urban and virtual, and technology, internet, health. Currently, she is researching and looking at sand as a material through which to understand social, cultural, and environmental and geographic issues. Nehal is the Science and Technology Editor at The Conversation Canada and the Editor-in-Chief of Studio Magazine. She is in residency at the Theatre Centre in Toronto, where she is developing a live arts event that examines privacy, consent, and surveillance in public spaces. Our other guest today is Dr. Idil Abdillahi, an assistant professor in the School of Disability Studies, cross-appointed to the School of Social Work, and the first ever advisor to the Dean on Anti-Black Racism at the Faculty of Community and Social Services at Ryerson University. Dr. Abdillahi is a critical Black interdisciplinary scholar, artist, researcher, policy analyst, grassroots organizer, experienced practitioner across healthcare, institutional policy, and social service settings. Dr. Abdillahi is published widely on an array of topics, including mental health, poverty, HIV/AIDS, organizational development, and several other key policy areas at the intersection of Black life and state interruption. So I'd like to welcome both of our guests today. And the next thing we will do is go straight into the screening. 15-minute piece. It's just actually under 15 minutes, closer to 13 minutes. We're going to have you join us live as we screen this together, and then we're going to go into a panel discussion and as well audience questions. So if we can roll the images and the film as
Zola, one Americano with cream from Elm Cafe, pick up 9:30.
Americano with cream has been ordered from Elm Cafe for 09:30.
Zola, renew prescription for lorazepam from the pharmacy on campus.
Filing renewal. Your request has been denied. Calling Dr. Bontet.
Hello, Jay Didiero. Your emergency appointment with Dr. Bontet is at 12:30 p.m. today. To confirm this appointment, say confirm.
Confirm.
Honestly, I am kind of freaking out about finals. Are you coming to the library to study?
Yeah, but not till later. I've got to go see the doctor to renew my prescription for anxiety.
Still having those panic attacks, huh?
Yeah. I can't flunk out of this semester too. I'll text you when I'm done, okay?
You can. I got rid of my phone.
What? Did you drop it again?
No, I opted out.
Opted out of having a phone?
Kind of like that, but from everything. I got freaked out about how much there was out there about me. Like, I posted about staying up all night playing video games, and this company sent me caffeine pills. Can you believe that shit? So I deleted all my social media. I gave up my phone. Anyways, I'll be at the library. I'll see you later.
Later.
Hello, Jay. I see you here about your prescription. You were flagged as non-compliant for drinking while taking lorazepam.
What? Why? I don't understand.
The system indicated that you posted a photo of wine you'd been drinking, and you were warned about drinking and taking lorazepam when you signed up.
You're tracking my social media?
We make it a policy to keep an eye on our patients. We just want to make sure you're not doing any harm to yourself.
I never agreed to that.
Actually, you did. Look, we talked about this. Okay, even though you're non-compliant, I can set you up with a prescription at full cost.
I can't afford that. I'm a student.
Okay, let me see what I can do. We have a program where we track all of your activities and we set you up with a monitor. And if you're clean for 15 days, we can get you back on your prescription.
I can't wait 15 days. My finals are in a week.
I'm sorry, Jay. I don't have any other options for you.
They refused to give me my prescription because I had one glass of wine.
How did they even know? Did you tell them?
No, I posted it online. They track their patients apparently to make sure that they take their medicine properly. Now I have to wear this stupid thing and stay clean for like 2 weeks. I don't know how I'm gonna get through this without my meds.
The system is so messed up. They're watching us all the time and we have no choice. This is why I quit it all. Listen, I think I can help you out. Come with me. It's gonna be fine. Don't worry, we got this. You'll have to turn off your phone before we go in. They have to keep moving locations.
Hi. Can I get your cell phone, please?
Thanks. I'll put it here and you can get it on your way out. Just take a seat, please.
Number 79.
Call from Dr. Bontet.
Hello?
Good morning, J. Didiero. You have an emergency appointment scheduled with Dr. Bontet at 9:30 a.m. today. To confirm this appointment, say confirm.
You have an appointment with University Counseling Services at 10 o'clock, followed by a study session with Carl 11 o'clock.
Confirm. Zola, cancel my counseling appointment and text Carl. I'll tell him myself. Hey, Doc. Got some good news for me?
Good morning, Jay. I've called you here this morning because of some concerning behavior we've noticed.
What is it? I haven't had anything to drink, which you already know because that damn thing goes off all the time, even at night.
The system reported lorazepam in your blood, and we know it didn't come from us.
Wait, how do you know that? You're only monitoring my blood alcohol levels.
We monitor all activities, including other substances in your system.
Hi, folks. We're back, and I'd like to bring our guests, Idil Abdillahi and Nehal El-Hadi, back on screen with us. And we are now going to move into our conversation and discussion. First of all, I'd like to say this is an amazing piece. It's really important and timely. We appreciate you all releasing it last year. And I'd like to start with you, Nehal. And the first piece I'd like to ask you around is, can you tell us like what your motivations were for the script, like just the actual, what you chose to include and what you chose to highlight? Maybe you can just start with that, and then we'll move into the second part of the question.
So somebody had, first of all, thank you for having me here and screening the film and inviting me. It's really cool to see how the film has been making its way in the world. It came about because the producer, Sava Sahali Singh, was doing a postdoc at Queen's, and she had put together the screening surveillance film series. So it's actually one film out of 3 that looked at different aspects of surveillance. She had put a call out looking for screenwriters, and somebody had sent it to me just because of the work that I was doing in my PhD at the time, which was looking at the relationships between virtual and material spaces and how things that happened online would have an effect offline. And so I reached out to Sava and started writing a film about, like, a short screenplay, or initially started writing a treatment that looked at social media, surveillance, and healthcare. And that became the script. At the time, I was also teaching at university and was really, really struck by how undergraduate students seem to be going through an inordinate amount of stress and demands, and were feeling really overwhelmed. So everything kind of came together in that film.
Okay, and I'm just going to move over now to Idil. Idil, I'm going to ask you a question, and it's just to kind of get the viewers familiar. Where do you enter this topic, and how does this piece strike you? We've heard a little bit about Nehal, how she wrote the screenplay or the treatment, and then it turned into this piece. Can you tell us a little bit about how your work ties into the screening of Blaxites, please?
Absolutely. So Nehal's film and the script writing and her work in research quite well with mine, just in the context of looking more broadly at the experiences of women and the impacts of, capital, platform capital, the impact of surveillance, interconnected systems, and more specifically, my work actually looks at that similarly to Nehal's, more broadly from a Black studies perspective, but then hones in more specifically on the way institutions create interruptions that have significant impacts on people's lives, which is demonstrated quite well throughout the film. And so when thinking about how Nehal had written the film and the treatment of it, and when I was invited to respond to her work and her scholarship, it was certainly an honor, because it does a few things. One of those things being that it makes very material the experience of surveillance. It centers a Black woman, it centers mental health, it centers exclusion. And ultimately what the film shows us is what is at stake for Black people, what is at stake for Black lives when we don't take seriously the implications of algorithms. And so I'm quite thankful for Nehal's work in that it really animates that in a very stark and important way. And in particular, because I think that there's a way that Black people, and I'm also going to use the word Black bodies, are expected that, or the expectation is that surveillance is visited on them because of historical kinds of issues. So my work specifically also looks to tease that out and looks to how surveillance studies and studies around AI are still, there is a gap in terms of the issue of Blackness, in terms of the issue of health, because of the conception of how we understand surveillance and those that are to be surveilled, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And it's exactly why we have you here. And so I'm going to move to the next question about some of the characters in your work, Nehal. And so the question I have for you is around Dr. Bontet, about Jai and Carl, and why they make the decisions and choices they do, and their values. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think, like in the film, Jai is just a university student who is just trying to live her life, right? Like trying to get by, trying to, see her friends and socialize and also study and work. She's dealing with, like the stresses of being a Black woman in university. And also dealing with the consequences of what it means when you're not afforded the luxury of being able to maybe just, live your life in particular ways. So that's where she's coming from. The doctor is, also he's trying to heal his patient or cure his patient in within the confines and context of how Western healthcare is being delivered. The software that they're using is sold to the doctors as a way of helping them improve their efficiency, of getting better outcomes, of helping them deal with an overwhelmed healthcare system too. So even though he comes across as really cold and detached, I don't think that his intention is to cause harm. It's more to be like, listen, I don't have a lot of time. I have to see so many patients. I don't have the time. Like compassion and empathy happens to be a luxury sometimes in the healthcare encounter. And, there isn't the time to fully develop and connect with and associate with a patient or a client, especially a patient or a client who does not reflect who you are. Right. And so I think one of the things that I wanted to show in this film too isn't necessarily that people are bad or good, but that they're working against systems that don't allow them the ability to choose between bad and good.
So I'm going to bring a little tension in here, and I'm going to, pull Idil in. I like the way you said, heal the patient and help. You also brought forward this drive to efficiency. And I want to highlight, as I move this question to Idil, that being afforded the luxury, who is afforded the luxury in a healthcare system that's increasingly become privatized and has vastly become so in COVID, right? And so there are some people who can get everything they need because they have the money and they have the relationships to do that. And so efficiency only applies to some people. As we know from the literature, it doesn't apply to all people. The other piece I wanted to kind of ground as I ask Idil to come in is around how austerity and how healing is not really part of the equation. As somebody who's deeply committed to clinical care and public health systems, the reality is that these kinds of tools, when they're offered, are not offered from a place of compassion. They're offered from another place. And so, Idil, I'd like to ask you, in terms of your experience, both as a clinical person who's engaged and supported, as well as someone who's developed things, can you kind of speak to how that luxury works, how that, who gets the compassion, who they can afford to give compassion to, and how that gets into the kinds of work that you do around how the state interrupts BlackLife, and typically not for the better?
That's actually a great question, Lana. And I think maybe what might be helpful is to step back and sort of begin with the broader issue of austerity and who that's helping. So none of us. And I may be being slightly naive, but I can imagine that most doctors don't go into the profession to be focused on efficacy in the ways that we're talking about here, and in the ways that center quick services, in the ways that decenter care, and likely what many folks in the health profession and allied health profession went into this for. The issue of austerity impacts all of us because, first and foremost, governments are not necessarily invested in all citizens' health and wellness. And I think COVID is a great example of that. And so I think what Nehal's, not only the film pointed to, but what Nehal said earlier is that there's a piece of this where notions of efficiency and efficacy in this context, neoliberalism, machine sort of fast learning, automated kinds of care, these things impact all of us. They impact the practice of doctors. They impact the practice of allied healthcare professionals. They impact the ways that we prescribe. They also impact the way patients experience the health encounter, which is exactly what Nehal is saying. Now, we understand that obviously things like austerity, things like poor healthcare, things like inaccessibility is not experienced the same across populations. And so when austerity happens, of course, it is going to further impact the most marginalized. And so when we do create tools, when we do create, for example, these interventions, I think, like I said earlier, what we do have to notice is that the tools that we create are not going to be outside of racist bias, sexist bias, ableist bias, because ultimately it is about sort of fast kinds of care. It is about trying to get, in very many ways, patients to comply using tools and resources. So in terms of, do these things benefit, who do these things benefit? I think that ultimately I'm saying that they don't benefit all of us in a lot of ways, but then I'd like us to sort of move down more to the specificity and look at the ways in which when we create these kinds of tools, inherently they exclude certain people. And I think as a practitioner and as a person who shares learning students with future practitioners, I think one of the really big important takeaways here out of Nehal's script writing and the embodiment of this, the experience of surveillance with and on Black people, is to really highlight the implications of care again. And I think for me, what's really, really important here is the end of that film, the deleting, the removal, the further isolation that was actually created by way of these system engagements, by way of wanting to sort of extend care in a particular way that actually removes the kind of practice that we require. And I'm not at all opposed to technology. I think what I'm offering here today is to say that we need to be more diligent about understanding that technology is not benign, that there are real implications, and that those implications are visited on different bodies and different people differently. And I think that's sort of the contention that I would like us to take seriously, and in particular in that way to think about how that impacts Black people, if that's fair. I don't know if that answers your question, Lana.
Oh, it most definitely does. And I want to say thank you for that. And I want to remind folks who have just tuned in that you're here present on June 3rd on AI Unleashed Implications for Black Life at Ready for Black Lives. And I'm now going to move over to bringing Nehal back into the conversation, given what Idil has just said, and in particular, implications for care, which is where I live a lot, particularly given my work in artificial intelligence, clinical care applications, and their connection to justice. When we think about what should Jai do, like what are the kinds of options that she actually had to take, and how does thinking about Jai and not the clinicians that chose to purchase this technology kind of do a particular kind of work where the question is always typically put towards the individual and the system gets to go almost unnoticed. So when that gets brought to you, so what could Jai do that's different? How do you respond to that? What could she do that's different, and how does the system that made that choice go missing?
Before I answer that question, could I just say that I'm having a really, really hard time right now with this word care, and how the kind of care that we're talking about right now and its applications are really deadly. I don't want to be cared for or taken care of in this manner, right? Like what Jai is going through in the film is, under the guise of care, of also putting the system in a way that it is supposedly more able to take care of her than she is to take care of herself. And so, I don't need to tell you about the ways in which care has been employed in a murderous and deadly way within these systems of healthcare delivery, especially for Black women. Like, I don't need to go into that, but I'm really I don't want to use the word care in this setting. I don't want its implications and its associations right now, because this is not care. This is not exhibiting a desire for somebody else's well-being. This is about a financial bottom line. AI, machines, social media, they don't care for you. They don't care for the intimacies and intricacies and wonder and joy and pain of life, right? And not of Black life, And I wrote about this elsewhere, that in order for systems to become used or employed in the preservation of Black life, they have to contend with its complexities, right? So to have a system to have an algorithm deciding who or not is worthy of care, or because at the end of the day too, I think that it's not the algorithm that does it, but it's the people who hide behind the algorithm to enact like whatever it is they want to enact isn't ever about care. Go ahead, please.
I'm going to jump in there, and your observation is more than astute. It's so accurate. I see it all the time. I develop artificial intelligence. I'm consulted about it, and this is the language that keeps seeping in. And I always kind of raise my eyebrow, and I'm like, just like, what do we mean by care, right? Who are we caring for? And is it that we are suggesting that an inanimate machine given commands by the very same people who weren't caring for us originally can somehow fill the gap? And I don't think it's a coincidence that when we opened our discussion today, we were actually talking about the death of Black and Indigenous people in a quote care system, right? And so when you talk about the murderous consequences, these are not hyperbolic statements. These are in fact, they're facts, they're in blood and they're in cemeteries. And so I'd like us to to have you and Idil kind of touch base around the doctor's conduct, right? The clinician's conduct, and the way his priorities are not actually ever brought into question. And we have that problem right now in Canada. So we have a number of physicians in particular and other clinicians who are looking to these technologies and who don't have any accountabilities and they don't have any oversight. They can just choose whatever they need as if it's a personal choice, like whether I choose to have one app or another. And the considerations of who's affected by them are often not completely on the table. And if it is, it's in the guise of a patient engagement, someone hand-selected who's going to say and do what they expect to say and do. And there's this fetishization of the patient versus dealing with populations who have collectively experienced. So I want to put you two in conversation and ask the clinician here, the doctor, and we're talking not just about the one in the film, but he's so accurately presenting, as so many are. Can you give me your thoughts and those who are attending with us today? How are we to think about clinicians? As Idil said, we don't necessarily think they're starting off on the wrong foot always, but what does this particular piece tell us about where we are right now in relationship to what we can expect, not only as Black and Indigenous peoples, but just in terms of what society is deciding to do without consent?
How do you want to go ahead?
No, please.
Yeah, I think ultimately, like Nehal hit it on the head, and I'm glad that Nehal said that, because ultimately I think that for many of us involved in this conversation, we know what is at stake in terms of care, and the use of that word and the deployment of that word. And I think that in our refusal of the word, there's something else that is being asked here, which I think that is, I don't want to miss out here. And that's ultimately the fact that that is still the taxonomy in which these folks are dealing with. And I think that when we begin to understand the relationship between Black people in general and systems, our first relationship is one that's sanctioned. And so the refusal of the word care has to also come alongside the idea that these are entrapments, right? These are fundamental entrapments. And I think that we have to name that. And I think that that's quite important in centering that. And I think what is really important here as well is exactly what Nehal said again is about, yes, there's the algorithm, but there are people behind the algorithm. And so I think it's always important to center the fact that we are not just talking about machine learning. People create these machines. And that's why earlier in the talk, I began by saying these are not benign systems by any means. And I think the huge contention here is the fact that what these systems are creating, yes, they have a profit bottom line, but it is about control, compliance, sanctioning, monitoring. Absolutely. That is fundamentally the intention here. At no point, even when, in this case, quote, the patient was insightful, as they would say in the medical field, right? Or was resourceful, that still was a point of sanction. And the other part of it as well is that these tools aren't created for those purposes. And so therefore the reliance on them to create, to function in that way is both disingenuous and dangerous, which is what we're talking about here. And I think in that conversation, what also has to be put in place is precisely the fact that we can't just, I don't think we can talk about the tool without talking about the clinician, without talking about the system. And I think a really important thing that we also have to underline here that I don't want to miss out in this conversation is all the ways, like I think the rest of that film that we didn't get to see, right? And that's also really important for us to talk about. And those things include going to pick up your prescription and having certain kinds of ID markers that are required of you, certain further experiences depending on the neighborhoods that you also then live in that also has an impact on how much ID or how much more further surveillance that you're going to need to engage. So ultimately, like many things, this is a beginning conversation. I think that's why it's called Toward. I think that it starts with a really important provocation that Nehal has provided in this discussion. And I think there's just far much more that we need to talk about. And I think as a person who accesses these systems, as a person who receives healthcare like many other Black women and many other Black people, we also have to think about the fact that many people are still currently in those situations. People are currently held against their will in hospitals right now today. People are being told that they cannot be released from hospital only and until. And so while we're sort of imagining and deconstructing what these systems are, I also think it's important for us to live in the material and physical world, right? And that material and physical world today is that these things are happening right now, right? There are people who we are, quote, using care, for example, in the context of addiction, where we're saying, we'll let you drive a car when you blow into this machine. And again, these tools are not used with everybody, right? So I also think it's really important for people who may be new to this conversation to understand that we're not talking about the future, we're talking about right now. This is happening in this moment, it's happening right now. And let's not be confused because we seem to have a, quote, good healthcare system in Canada, right? We know that everybody doesn't have benefits, and we know certainly that insurers do have and weigh out healthcare statistics, healthcare relationships, issues of compliance, and broader healthcare when making decisions about who to, quote, provide healthcare services and care to.
And Nehal, can you jump in there?
I mean, I agree with everything that Idil said, but I do want to point out that Jai is in this situation because of two major things. One is that as a young Black woman, she doesn't necessarily know how to advocate for herself or what her options are. So in the beginning, when she was told, you need this medication and you get it if you give us access to survey you. And then we're going to actually monitor and regulate you for 2 weeks to give it back to you, which means that now things are conditional in a particular way on her. So she has to submit to discipline, and then she has to be disciplined in order to receive it. And those are and that is a result of her not being able to say, no, this is a transgression on myself, right? As Black women, we are expected to submit to this regulation of our bodies. The other thing too is that Jai would not have been in this situation if she could afford the medication. So that's a whole other Like, that's a whole other thing. Why is the medication being charged for? And yes, we do have a particular kind of healthcare system, but this isn't beyond the realm of possibility, or it doesn't feel like I didn't have to take a leap of imagination to write this film. It was a little bit of a sideways shuffle, right? That was it. Because when we start talking about the delivery of healthcare and money, when it gets portrayed as like, all right, this is a way for us to keep taxes low by making sure that the medication is not only going to who needs it, but who will use it properly, right? So if Jay had access to financial resources, all of this would be moot. Like laws actually, like these regulatory attempts only apply for people who cannot pay their way out of it. And the people who can pay their way out of it aren't losing money over it. Like it's not amounts that matter to them, And so I think those are really like two important points to make about this. When Idil talks about also what's unseen and what's hinted at, I think talking about a young Black woman's experience in post-secondary education, this was like the very tip of the part of the iceberg that was above water and all of the other things that come with it. What happens next? Like when Jai takes herself offline, like what happens? How is she going to be monitored? And we all know that by refusing surveillance, you actually create greater scrutiny on yourself. So there's no real winning.
But there can be. And one of the things we hope to do over this coming time together, not just in this set of episodes, but as the year goes on, is provide people with those tools, because there are a host of options that, just like money can buy you out of regulations and the law, knowledge and collective knowledge and action can also act as a buffer and a protective factor. But it doesn't change the fact that the system needs to be brought into alignment. And I wanted to kind of touch on when you talked about it wasn't a far reach, the scenario that's played out. And I'd actually to point out to you that in British Columbia, that's not a far reach at all, that's the law. And so we saw just a year and so ago, the Public Health Act in British Columbia allow them to keep people tethered to geographies so that they can be force-fed medication whether or not they consent. And this has been brought into as part of what public health's power is, and how regulation and legislation is used against some people and not others. So you're not far at all. We have this functioning right here in various places across the country. And what we need to do actually is document where that's happening and decide collectively whether or not that is part of the social agreement between ourselves and our healthcare system. One of the things I wanted to point out as well is how human rights just go out the window. And that's quite a case. As someone who's involved deeply in that work, who I too, from the University of Toronto, Faculty of Medicine, and my work is around artificial intelligence, and the disciplining piece always seems to be obscured. It's always for your own good. And I want to ask both of you, and maybe Idil, you could jump in first. What do we really think about this idea that the doctor might be justified, that this system is doing a good? Because there are people who will watch this and think, well, it did what it was supposed to. She's not supposed to be drinking. And this is the problem with, quote, you people. You want to be able to do whatever you want. These are the kinds of comments that I've heard in meetings about why certain kinds of technology should be unleashed to control and surveil people. But is that really the job and the contract that we have with our clinical providers? And you spoke to the fact that the students, Jai and this, didn't necessarily know how to push back. But is that really fair? I guess kind of what I'm saying, in a system that has taken a liberty to which it has not gotten any consent. And so yes, there may have been fine print, but there is a reasonable expectation that is always exercised within the law. And it is not a reasonable expectation that your clinician is monitoring you outside of your clinical appointment. That is next level. That is supposedly what is not supposed to happen in a country that has a constitutional democracy. And so, Idil, given that human rights seem to have gone out the window, given that the Constitution doesn't seem to be functioning here, and most importantly, that even the idea of what this clinician, this doctor in this film is supposed to be doing isn't even happening in relation to their responsibilities and accountabilities. What would you say to one, the audiences that will be subjected to this, and two, the clinicians that are thinking about potentially purchasing this kind of convenient monitoring technology?
So I guess first and foremost, I think I forget the word that you said earlier, Blana, but you said for the people who are watching and thinking, there's nothing wrong with this. Like, what's wrong with this? There's absolutely everything wrong with this. There's no moment at all to think that there's nothing wrong with this. If people wanted to go into healthcare to stick bans on people or insert things in people, that is not what the hell I don't think that's what anybody signed up for. So first and foremost, I just want to make that absolutely clear that that is not for me. We talk about, like, I want to just put aside this piece around contracts and rights because I'll come back to that. But there is no, in my opinion, there's no reason why any patient should not have all the necessary information that they require to make the best decisions for themselves. And I think that that's every healthcare provider and allied healthcare provider's role, is to best educate and have the person make the best autonomous decisions about their body and their lives, period. And I just absolutely want to make that clear. Now, I have a critique about this idea of contracts and rights, because Black people have always been outside of that, period. I don't deal in rights and rights discourses because we are outside of rights and rights discourses in many ways. And so, yes, there are the things that are written on paper and on policy. And yes, there's certain things that have to be followed, absolutely. But I think what this particular film tells us, and what I know from my practice and from my own lived experience, is that policy does not always go into practice, and human rights are not extended to everybody in the exact same ways. And as such, I think that because when we deal with more vulnerable populations, we have a duty and accountability to ensure that we go above and beyond that, understanding what the impact of being outside of that discourse is, first and foremost. And I think that when we begin to understand that because we understand these histories, because we understand these legacies, firstly with populations, and then more generally when we're dealing with people who are experiencing anything, it doesn't matter to what degree, but when people are experiencing healthcare concerns, that in general, we know that people are afraid and concerned, and there are power relationships there that demand that we do far much more to ensure that people understand what's happening for them. I think that that's really important. I also think that we have to think about what is the overall goal in our interactions with people who are accessing healthcare services, right? Or health services in general. And if our outcome is to contain and to monitor and to not better the conditions or alleviate the conditions or support people in understanding those conditions, I don't know that any intervention is helpful. And I think that that's something really important to think about. And I think the other part that I would say is to truly sort of consider and weigh out what is the purpose of the tools and what is the purpose of using these AI tools and functions? What is the actual purpose of that? And are we using these tools to respond to a symptom of a much greater problem? And are we prepared to contain with some very serious privacy related violations? And I think the last thing that I want to say to that is that another piece that we have to consider is, in general, again, the ways that all of these systems are interconnected, and in particular for vulnerable people. And so I can't expect that I can have access to a person's healthcare information in the evening, happen to know, for example, that they're on welfare or on ODSP, or also may have a criminal justice issue, and I'm using that word criminal justice in air quotes, you can't see me. But the point is, I know from working in the system that already we have interconnected systems, and that's what my dissertation work is about. That's what it displays. That's what it shows. Without Nehal's film, right? Without Nehal's film. Nehal and I know this, Lana, you know this, many people watching this know this, right? We are already sanctioning people outside of these things, outside of sort of the physical kind of tool. And I think that's also really important. So when we think about AI and technology, what's happened in this film and what Nehal has done really well is again, I keep saying this over and over again, really clearly animate the issue in a real and relevant way. I watched it several times, right? And I'm going to use it as a teaching tool. It's an important important film. But there's other things that Nehal is also pointing us to in that film that are also as important as the tool that she's telling us about, in my opinion, as I watched it. And I think it's important for us to contend with what Nehal is showing us in the film, which are all the things that are trespasses outside of that tool. And that is the algorithm of anti-Blackness, that is the algorithm of patriarchy, that is the algorithm of poor healthcare service in general, right? And so I think for me, in engaging with the film and that work, that is a huge takeaway for me. And I think that's what I really want to impress upon folks of what I've learned from it. So that's helpful.
So I'd like to actually comment on a piece that came across from our attendees today. And there was a piece here that talked about AI putting a nail in the coffin, Indigenous resistance, and land claims over our bodies and community economics. And I think, Idil, part of what you spoke to very beautifully kind of provides us the arc to think through that. And the language of trespass is so important, because first it means that we have a right to self-possession and self-determination. And as you said, in so many ways, rights and rights discourses hold Black people outside of those institutions, often as not even fully human. And so to the comment on the screen around further entrenching inequities, we can see in this screenplay that you provided us with, this short, how that can happen. And so what does it mean when there is a country like Canada that spends so much effort on ensuring that some of us don't get to do what we're called to do, that we will not earn what we should earn simply because people make decisions about our lives so that they discount our pay, right? And we know that these things are true because they're reflected in the quote data of the state. And so the idea that there's so many Black and Indigenous folks and other folks who are being put under surveillance, and the idea of these tools of automation, I think, Nehal, you did an amazing job of just pointing out how this running at scale, tracking people in their everyday lives, and we've seen it during COVID. We've seen a complete abandonment of any kind of law or order. We've seen the state handing over records to police departments, very reminiscent of other acts of colonization and Europe in World War II and internment. We've seen our provincial and federal governments act in ways that are consistent with other contexts in which people are constantly controlled, manipulated, and disappeared into institutions and behind walls. And so I'd like to say I concur with the comment that was offered, but we have the opportunity to change that. Because part of what's going on with artificial intelligence is much like what they've done in finance and in war, which is there's only one track. There's only one way this can go, and it's a certain group of people that will control it and a certain group of people that it will be used for. But a lot of this is still on the table. And so I want to remind people who are watching, one, to provide your questions, and two, to remember this is a struggle. This is yet to be decided. Despite the fact that they keep showing us their teeth, they have not in fact won, and we can actually create and continue to push back in all the ways that we do on how the system works. And that brings me to the next question. How might we think about the piece that you've provided and the work that you've done in the field, Idil, as well as your experience, Nehal? How might we think about what the pushback can be? Because so much is coming at us, and we're told it's convenient. We see Jai, speaking to her phone, directing it to do things. And I think what it does is it really effectively introduces the kinds of control we give up, and we don't always know the full bargain that we've struck, because that device that allows her to speak into her phone and have something speak back is not tied to regulation, is not tied to anything that creates any boundaries. It is the very problem that she's contending with. Yet there are so many people, for reasons of mobility, of disability who will need those technologies. So what might we think about when we think about what it means to hold our space, and that Jai doesn't have to become so astute that she's looking for every fine print, and as you said, that selecting herself out of surveillance doesn't become as detrimental as being surveilled. And I want us to talk about this like collectively, versus the way the current society encourages us to, which is, if you can build a fortress around yourself, then you're golden. And some of those of us with tech skills can, but it leaves so many of us out. So I'm interested in a dynamic conversation. Idil, Nehal, jump in. What can we do? And offer people who are listening, who are feeling like, oh my God, like there's no hope. Can you speak to that?
So I look at the ways in which user-generated data is used in urban planning, which is what I did my PhD in. And there still is this excitement in planning about big data and using it to inform planning decisions, right? And it sounds very effective. It's like, what is the data telling us to do? And I was like, all right, cool. So if we are using this digital information that we have gathered to determine like things about the city, like how space is going to be used, how we're going to plan transit, this is pretty simple. If you're an activist, why don't we organize and perform the data that will give us the outcome that we want, right? So if we're looking at transportation planning, why don't we organize people to ride certain routes at certain times to show that there's demand, so that a low service neighborhood can be served and have routes planned towards it. Now, one of two things will happen when you perform data. One, you're going to get the outcome that you want because the evidence shows that this is what needs to happen. The second, and because I have a pessimistic and cynical streak, is what I believe will likely happen, is that the data will be called faulty. And when data doesn't serve the purpose that it was designed to serve, it becomes dismissed, right? So what happens when we, can performing data as an activist move actually generate the outcomes that we want? Can we pretend for what we, for the ideal that we need, right? And I think that the outcome of that is the data is faulty. We're just going to make the decision that we wanted to make anyway. Within the ways that the system works right now, I think that the only, in Jai's case in the film, I think the only thing that could have quote unquote saved her would have been her having some kind of astuteness or awareness of the ways in which her living her life subjected her to particular treatment at the hands of healthcare providers. And so I don't know, apart from making people more savvy, that what you can do within this system, or telling, or advocating for patients and being I'm going to come with you because when you go, or just teaching them how to negotiate, for example, with a psychiatrist, where after a quick 5-minute assessment, they get diagnosed with a condition that goes into a system that now affects their insurance rates, right? So I don't know how, apart from faking information or learning to manipulate information to get you the outcome that you desire, right? You just have to perform towards that. But then that data gets dismissed because it's bad, because it's not telling the people who want to manage things in a particular way.
And so I'm going to ask Idil if you can jump in here, because I think you definitely have some thoughts on this, as this is something that you work on, and I'd like to kind of just hear what that sounds like. And to folks out there, feel free to put your questions and we will go through them as we can. Idil, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I don't really have much more to say than what Nehal said, which is, really look at how do you make this livable, right? How do you animate this to be real? I don't have much more to add than that. I think the only other I guess caution, like Nehal, I'm fairly cynical as well. is that one of the things that we see is, again, the opt-out and the impact of the opt-out. And in the context of data, I think that that is just, we also need to consider what that opt-out data can look like, right? So when you're not there, supposedly, right? What does that look like? And I think, yeah. So I think I'll leave it there. I don't have much more to say.
Thank you. I'm going to jump into that gap around the opt-out. So there's numerous ways you can handle the opt-out. Sometimes it's called missing information, something I'm working on, as well as how absenting can actually be constructed. And to your point of the language of performing data, the question is, what data systems do you and don't you want to belong to? And that is not an option typically on the table. It's not an option often provided to clinicians. It's not an option definitely provided to people that will be put under these kinds of surveillances. And so there's this kind of perception that there's only one set of data systems, that there's only one internet, that there's only one set of platforms and they all function the same way. And I think that's one of the best pieces of propaganda that's ever been put out. In fact, there are not. There are more than one. And there are ways to not just perform the data, but make our data not accessible for the misidentification and the faulty readings. But again, it takes a particular kind of collective work and knowledge sharing, which is exactly what we are doing here today. Is for many people, this scenario is looming, if not already present. And there's very little discussion or spaces around what you can do. And so just like we pushed back against so many other kinds of bodily harm, and I see the kinds of ways in which this technology is used is a harm, because it is not being negotiated with the individual, nor the individuals, plural, who will be collectively affected. It is in fact an abuse of power and has to be understood as such. And I think that's part of understanding how data systems work and what your choices are. This is actually a system that is demonstrating exactly what AI should not be doing. And I'm just going to touch on this question here that's come up on the screen. Are you seeing much discussion of the impact on the utero to grave business surveillance healthcare model? Am I seeing much discussion in different spaces? It depends. And I'm going to offer this question up to also Nehal and Idil. In my work, I work on databases, bioinformatics, data science, constructing prototypes, and looking very carefully at how one's opportunities don't provide a full offering. So like you're told, as she was, oh, you signed this when you came into clinical care with us. That's not informed consent. And the law's been really clear about that. Yes, we do stand outside the law, but again, that savviness is about using whatever tools are available, no matter how flimsy. So I think one of the things I want to inject here is to point out that there are more than one set of systems to opt in and opt out of. We need to bring those systems into view. And those systems are tied to particular, as you said, we have to think about the clinical provider and the institution that the clinician is aligned with or works with. And there are clinicians, there are spaces that opt out of this. And I think just like we've seen in other movements, there are spaces which those people who do opt out as clinicians and as power brokers can provide additional support to people. They have to be also inspired and encouraged and supported to do that. We saw this when it came to the right to choose whether to have a child or not. There were folks who would just toe the line and didn't care what the needs and desires of people who were going to potentially become parents against their will. And there were those who stepped outside and said there's a right to do that. And so we have to inspire those clinicians to create those spaces so that we have alternative choices for folks that are mandated, because we know this has everything to do with how much money you have and how much freedom you can buy. And that is something that is almost completely not brought about. And I want to say thank you very much, Nehal, for highlighting that in the film, when the physician says, if you can pay for it, you can pass go and collect $200. And Idil, when you highlighted the fact that regulations are in fact very specific to whom the state and individuals seek to control and believe that they can get away with it. And so I want to come to another question here, and I want to just kind of go more broadly into your thoughts around AI and automation in managing Black, disabled, mat-identifying, imprisoned, and other oppressed populations, Idil, because this short allows us to open into many of the ways that folks are already being managed like this, and it's been put out of view. And now we're seeing it being rolled out, as we say, when you don't check for me, it's going to happen to you, and here we are. So can you give us your thoughts on AI automation in respect to managing Black, disabled, and mat-identified and imprisoned and other oppressed populations?
Absolutely. I feel like a broken record because I feel like I've said this 100 times already on this talk, but this film is really important, particularly for my work around that and for my teaching around that, for my livability around these issues, because again, it does a really important piece of work. And the important piece of work that it does is it addresses the mundanity of what surveillance, encounters with healthcare, encounters with systems look like without us necessarily even having to really imagine, like Nehal said, in this sort of elaborate way. But what I think it means in terms of those specific sites, imprisoned populations, people living with mental health issues, etc., is it actually just, so I guess if I step back, there are already ways in which we are surveilling and monitoring. And I want to like really just quickly draw on things like, the use of certain kinds of tools like community treatment orders, the use of or the pushing of people to get, IMs, injections, as opposed to like oral medication. These are all a part of this process, right? And so I want us to sort of, when we think about even technologies and algorithms, yes, today we're talking about something that is very specific and a kind of physical kind of technology. But I think, again, what I want to point people to, not just in my work, but what is in Nehal's film, right, is fundamentally the architectures. Like that is actually what Nehal is pointing us to, right? And I want to make that absolutely clear. The physical piece of technology is one piece of the story. And I think, if nothing else, what I want people to take seriously today is what is happening in the film in terms of these broader kinds of interconnections. So to come back, Lana, to your question about, well, what do we do and do we not give some information, and what are some of these strategies and how does this, I'm going to come to your question that you really asked me, I promise. But I want to say something. I want to say that in the context of BlackLife, because that is what my work is, that is what Nehal's work is, we don't even get the opportunity to decide to not disclose because it is mapped onto us, right? So I have to tell you that I'm not a mother and that I don't have children because your assumption is I'm a mother and that I have children, right? So there's certain things already, certain kinds of, in this case, algorithms mapped onto our bodies that further necessitate or prove what people may assume. So for the clinicians listening today and the allied health professionals listening today, I want to interrupt by saying, think about your notes as a technology, because while you may refuse the actual use of a particular AI tool in your organization or in your hospital or in your care center, that doesn't mean that another organization where you may be referring, or another hospital or another doctor might not be using that. And so in that case, so pay attention to that note, because that note will also determine whether or not someone else gets put on that bracelet or someone else gets put in a kind of compliance, a compliance-oriented and carceral-oriented care. Right? So those are another two things. So just to recap, number one, think about what you're writing, understand the pen as a technology, understand your notes as incarcerating, understand your notes as an architecture. And even if you as a provider of healthcare may not use it, consider the fact that another healthcare provider will. Consider what the impact of that is and consider how you're participating in that. Right? Consider what you think about the person coming in to get care. Consider what you make believable about them. Consider what you map onto their body. Consider what you think is acceptable about their behavior. Consider whether or not you believe, in this case, people cannot see me, but in that image, Consider if when I come in my track pants and I'm exhausted, if you believe that when I tell you I'm a doctor and a professor, whether or not you believe that's true, or when you go back to the nursing station, you Google me, right? That is an intervention. That is an intervention about believability. That is a lot of things, right? And that's what, again, we're speaking to. So now in the context of people living with mental health issues and so forth, again, I want to come back to the idea of we want people to participate in their life and in their care. And if we as clinicians and practitioners cannot do that, that's a problem for me, because no tool should be able to do that. And if that's the case, we have a way huger problem, because then we need to like universities need to stop having medical schools. We need to stop having psychology. We need to stop having social work. We need to burn it all down, right? So what are we prepared to do at this point? Are we prepared to reckon with the machine, which is both something else and ourselves, and make a change? Or are we sort of not going to do anything? So in the context of prisons, we know that there are ways that people are monitored already. Their use and the amount of healthcare that they use, why they use that healthcare. We know that within the context of addictions that this is used. We know that within the context of mental health, these are used. We know that within the context, for example, of people who we feel don't make the best decisions about their health, that we use these kinds of tools. So ultimately, I think it is to say, what is our goal here, right? What is our goal as providers, and what are we seeking to do? And so I think that's really huge. But what is at stake here is something far greater. And what is at stake here is one, in my opinion, for me, the loss of what we're trying to do here, which is alleviate the life conditions or the circumstance or whatever is happening for a person. And if we're willing to rely on tools to do that, then we might have to completely want to disabuse ourselves from what we think we're doing here, right? And that's the contention for me of what Nehal has presented today, and the film and the script.
To your point, Idil, that was perfect. I can't add anything to that. So I'm going to move us to the next piece. And I don't know, Nehal, if there's anything you wanted to jump into. Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually just kind of, I agree with everything that Idil said, but I wanted to take a step before we reach the point that she was talking about. If the information you collect from me to make a diagnosis is so important, then why is that information not shared with me? Why am I not one of the users of the healthcare system that shares my health data with a whole bunch of people who are going to make diagnoses and decisions about my healthcare? Why am I not given that information? Why am I not allowed access to it? And why am I not given the context that it belongs in either, so I can make informed decisions about my own body and my own healthcare? So when you go, and especially when you're talking about, for example, psychiatric diagnosis, show me how you are taking my words, show me the data that you are gleaning from them, that you are using to make this diagnosis that is going to affect my life in ways that you will never even imagine or know. Before we even get to what the information does or the ways in which I am read. I think that when Idil talked about the weaponization of a diagnosis by other healthcare professionals, I think that one of the ways of intervening in the production of this data or this information is to know that the patient is going to have access to it. Because I think that doctors' notes would change when it comes to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. When it comes to their notes, I think the language used will be much, much different if you are being held to account by the people that you are producing this data about. You know? And then if there is stuff in my diagnosis that I don't know about, I can take it to somebody else. I can make that choice about my data and my information, but give it to me. If it's so important, if it's so valuable, if it's so necessary, share it with me. And I think that having these systems, having this incredibly paternalistic approach to our own intimate information is where interventions need to begin happening.
I'd like to say thank you for that. And I'm going to bridge that to another conversation that I was actually asked to have in a print piece. And it was a piece around blockchain. And so blockchain is being heralded as the best way to make records, medical records, accessible to folks. And so I was interviewed about the piece, and it changed a bit by the time it came back to me, and I sought to opt out, and they were very committed to making sure that the piece was accurate. And what was part of that was, yes, this narrative that you spoke about was the information is important, therefore I should have access to it. But what that looks like in practice often, whether we're talking blockchain or other kinds of technological pieces of having that information, is that it's not all the same information. And what is written is not what is coded. And so when we moved from the handwritten note to the electronic medical and health record, we also moved from a language of the human to the language of the machine. And I'm talking here about natural language processing, which is one of the many areas I work across in AI. And natural language processing is that area where you take the words of humans and the writings, which are often referred to as free text, and you then process those so that it's intelligible to a automated system. And so there's this other piece that I would say we have to also do at the same time, which is interrogate what technologies are used behind the scenes, because it's possible to have your information. It's even possible to kind of, I always ask for the screen to be turned to me, and I read it, and I'm like, that's not accurate, please delete that, add that. But I'm lucky enough to be aware that this is a walking surveillance record. And sometimes, you forget yourself and you just talk like a normal person, and you're kind of rushed or you're tired and you forget to check the screen, and you don't know what's gone in there. You don't know what's been pulled, and you don't know who it's been shared with. So I think this is where I'm thinking about the collective systems. So I want to tie the weaponization of data. I want to tie the weaponization of having algorithms mapped onto one's body. And I want to bring it to this piece of imagination and creativity that you've displayed here in the hall, and the role of a creative imagination in framing and challenging resistive technology. So you talked about being able to have possession of that data, being able to make sure that what is contained therein is addressed. But I want to tie us a little bit back to what Idil said, which is that the pen is a technology, right? Those words are in fact a technology that align with particular systems and the work of the architecture that you're showing in this short film. And so I'm wondering here about how we as individuals might mobilize our imaginations for the things that we want, because I think what's at question is actually healthcare. That's what I loved about your piece, was that you bring into question the drive-through McDonald's that healthcare has been for some time. When the average patient time with a physician is 5 minutes or less, and 7 minutes is considered a long and luxurious appointment. This is where the desire for these kinds of tools to monitor and surveil begins to be pushed from. And so I think there's a calling into question of why this particular settler medical system that has no training around healing, it's not there. I'm on curriculum committees, there's no such word. There's no such concept. There's no such thing as reparative. There's no such thing as a collective understanding in the clinical care and training that any of our clinicians get in settler systems. And so how might imagination guide us to demand a wholesale change? Because part of what we're talking about here is tweaking the architecture. And reform, we know, for Black folks, in particular, and Indigenous folks in settler colonies, gets us a whole lot of nowhere. So what might you say about the transformative possibilities of imagination in framing and challenging and resisting oppressive technologies? And Nehal, I'm going to put this one to you.
Really? You're going to start with me?
I'm going to start with you, because we're in our last few minutes.
I love this question, by the way, Nehal, so I want you to answer, because I can't wait to answer.
Oh my God, I just think that asking this question right now at this particular moment in history is asking me to consider these systems not as death machines. And right now I can't, I'm trying to think beyond it. And I'm like, no, I'm a Black woman. I cannot afford for 1 second to believe that this system is not designed to be deadly. for me and for other people like me.
But it is, yeah.
That it's not designed to generate death where death does not need to be. When you, like everything that you go up against will shorten your lifespan, will create and produce disease and illness and dis-ease. So what role does imagination have in it beyond just being able to just get a little bit beyond survival? Like how can I think beyond evading my own death within this system? But this is this particular moment in history. And maybe next week, my answer will be different. You know? So, I don't know. Not right now. Right now, I don't know.
Idil?
I think for me, the role that imagination plays is precisely where the film ends, which is where Nehal's comments leave me today, which is today the level of not just despair, but also that moment of hope in delete at that end tells me it's the invitation to do something else, right? And so that's really important for me. And I wanna hold that in Nehal's script. And I don't want to hold that deleting as an end that is a goodbye, because I've been in that place as a Black woman, right? And here I am doing this talk now. And so I want to take that invitation, similarly to what Nehal described earlier, that said, get on that bus route, populate that bus, animate that, produce that work. So that's the imagination for me, because ultimately what that death is far too imminent. And for many of us, whether or not we want to participate in those systems, we are caught and captured by them regardless, right? And so I think about that. The other imagination for me, or the possibility for me in the film that is both a possibility and a caution, is when Jai's friend took her to the other space. And Jai was able to get what Jai needed, but yet and still. So the hope is in that other space, right? It's in that, whatever that space was, but I also still take very seriously that did not free Jai, because Jai was still called in. So what that third space, we still have a set of work to do there. So if for everyone who's on listening to this today, I guess that's my invitation. Is how do we occupy that third space, but still figure out a way to protect Jai from getting caught up by that other person, right? So that's the other offering, or the other way I want to enter or leave, I guess, this conversation. And again, I want to invite people to watch that film again, maybe now after we've had this conversation, and think about and look at the script, right? Look at the architecture, look at the mundanity, look at the seriousness of it, look at the interconnectedness of it, look at all the stories that are in there, right? Because there is many different things that are being pointed to in the film. And I think if we take it seriously, it shows us what's really at stake, both from a theoretical level and a practice level, right? And I that's really important for people to understand. This is for doctors, it's for clinicians, it's for activists. Like, watch this. It's for patients, quote unquote. It's for all of us. Every one of us is in that script, because every one of us is caught up in this architecture, period. We don't have an opportunity right now, based on the script, to opt out. The opt out right now is in that also space that Nehal created in this film. How do we interrupt that last part, which is getting caught up? Right? I want to take that invitation seriously today.
I want to take this opportunity to say thank you, Idil. I want to say thank you, Nehal, for your input, for your deep thoughts, for the work that you do, and the imagination that you provide us with. And all I can say is you took us out on the right note, both of you. The architecture is what is at hand. we have a place in dismantling it as well as building that space that we both need and desire. I'm going to encourage folks in all their disciplines to become knowledgeable about what skills and what ways they can manipulate artificial intelligence, whether it's riding the bus, creating that third space, creating alternative data spaces that allow us to get what we need and to be taken actual care of and to be cared for in a way that does not have to do with, quote, evading our own death. Thank you for that, Nehal. And I want to remind us on our outtake that our health is inextricably tied to the air that we breathe, the land, our relationships with kin, flora, and fauna, and the degree to which we can navigate these unmolested and without fear. Typically, as we well know, AI is not within or receiving legal censure or discipline like the people who we are that are subjected to it. It also is in the process of rolling back over 300 years of gains against the resistance and the ongoing resistance we have against the barbarism of colonization and its manifestations. So as we leave you today, I encourage you to watch not just once, but several times, and the other pieces that are with it. You'll be able to find those Writing for Black Lives and online. And I want to bring us all to the attention that part of the reason this can happen is because it's being allowed to happen. We don't have many tools in a nation state that is in the midst of occupation on Indigenous land, but we do have some. And we need to use those and bend those in any way that we can. And so I'm going to encourage you to understand in this moment that the federal government has made not only what Nehal has in her film possible, but far more egregious grasps into your lives by people you don't know, doing things to you that you don't want. And so I point you to Bill C-11 that is up on the floor, and it is everything we should be afraid of. And so please, to your premier, to your prime minister, this bill cannot be redeemed. There's not one legal scholar, activist, or anybody who thinks clearly that thinks you can redeem C-11. So please take a look at it. Citizen Labs has a wonderful analysis of it in plain language. Please take a look at that. And I want you to pay attention in whatever province you're in. I'm here in Ontario, and in Ontario, they removed basically our Privacy Act and replaced it, or in the process of replacing it with a Big Corporations Privileges Act. And so keep your eyes out, keep your pen on your technologies, and make sure that you are mobilizing what you have and that we do it collectively. It can't just be each of us going into our own little places, coming up with our own little fancy things. The alarm has been rung, and this is an opportunity to rethink bioethics. This is a bioethics issue, and I want to point out to you that bioethics has gone missing. And we're going to come to that in about 2 weeks when we reschedule the first episode and talk about why bioethics has gone missing. Where are they? And who is considered a bioethicist? Because you just met two amazing folks that are practicing bioethics in the real, that are protecting and seeking out the lives that need to be protected and that need to be uplifted. But the bioethicists, my peers, my fellow bioethicists, I'm looking for you. And so on that note, I look forward to you joining us next Thursday, same time, same channel, different folks, but we're taking this issue a little farther. Again, thank you, Nehal. Thank you, Idil. And let's keep being critical, but let's keep building that third space, and we won't let them undo or make our data faulty. We're going to hold their feet to the fire, and we're going to win because there's no other choice. Thanks, everybody. Bye.